Tonight we're going to explore one of the most tragic and beautiful stories in Hollow Knight, the tale of the Radiance. From her ancient reign as a goddess of light and dreams, through betrayal and desperation, to her final, devastating defeat. This is a story of memory and forgetting, of light consumed by darkness, told slowly and gently to help you drift away. If you'd like, leave a comment about where you're listening from, and tomorrow, if this helps you sleep, consider liking or subscribing. But for now, let's go back to the very beginning, to a time before kingdoms, before cities, before even thought itself existed in Hallownest. To understand the Radiance, we must first understand what she was. In the world of Hollow Knight, there exist beings far beyond ordinary bugs, creatures of immense power and influence known as higher beings. These are not simply strong warriors or wise leaders. They are something closer to gods, forces of nature given consciousness and form. They possess power that transcends the physical world, reaching into dreams, memories, and the very fabric of reality itself. The Radiance was one such being. She was composed of pure light, a blazing presence that existed primarily in the realm of dreams. She wasn't a physical ruler who walked among her followers, giving commands or building monuments. Instead, she was a spiritual presence, a warmth in the mind, a connection that bound all who worshipped her into something greater than themselves. Where there is light, there must also be darkness, and in this world, that darkness was the void, emptiness, absence, the complete opposite of everything the Radiance represented. These two forces, light and dark, existed in eternal opposition, though in those ancient days they rarely touched. The Radiance was neither cruel nor kind in the way we understand those words. She simply was, like the sun that rises each morning. And long before there were kingdoms or cities, before there was civilization as we know it, there was the Radiance, and there were those who basked in her light. The Moth tribe were the Radiance's chosen people, or perhaps more accurately her children. They were creatures born from her light, beings whose very existence was intertwined with hers in ways that went deeper than worship. These moths were peaceful, gentle creatures who lived in constant connection with the dream realm. Their lives were simple, guided by instinct and devotion rather than complex thought or ambition. Imagine what it was like for them to live in a state of perpetual warmth, to feel always the presence of something greater, loving, protective. The moths didn't worship the Radiance in the way we might imagine worship today, with rigid ceremonies or strict doctrines. Instead, their devotion was a state of being. They meditated in her light. They dreamed her dreams. They felt her presence as naturally as they felt the air around them. Their consciousness was not entirely their own, but shared, connected through the Radiance into something resembling a vast, peaceful network of thoughts and feelings. They built temples to honour her, carved statues in her image, especially at the highest peak of what would later become Hallownest, a place called the Crown. These weren't grand structures designed to impress others, because there were no others to impress. They were quiet places of reflection, where moths could sit in stillness and feel the connection grow stronger, where the boundary between the physical world and the dream realm grew thin as gossamer wings. Life for the moths was not about progress or achievement. There were no goals beyond the simple continuation of this peaceful existence. They hatched, they grew, they dreamed, they eventually returned to the light. Generations passed this way, Countless cycles of life lived in harmony with their goddess. There was no sense of missing anything, no desire for something different. How could there be? They knew only warmth, only belonging, only the gentle embrace of shared consciousness. When you live in such perfect peace, time loses meaning. Days blend into years, years into centuries. The moths didn't mark time or record history. Why would they? Nothing changed. The light was eternal, the connection unbroken, the peace absolute. This was all they knew, all they needed to know. For countless generations, this was their entire world. Simple, beautiful, and complete. But what was the Radiance herself truly like? To call her a tyrant would be a profound misunderstanding. She didn't rule through fear or control. She wasn't a monarch demanding tribute or obedience. Think instead of how sunlight falls on your face on a warm afternoon. Natural, life-giving, present, but not demanding. The Radiance was like that, but for the mind instead of the body. Her power was fundamentally psychic, emotional, operating through influence rather than force. She existed primarily in the dream realm, that strange space between waking and sleeping where thoughts take form and memories drift like clouds. From there she could touch the minds of all who were open to her, creating that shared consciousness the moths experienced. It wasn't an invasion, at least not originally. It was an invitation, a connection freely given and freely received. Through her, the moths felt each other's presence even when apart. Through her, they experienced a kind of unity that transcended their individual existence. Was she benevolent? By the standards of her nature, yes. She protected her children, nurtured them, gave them purpose and belonging. She wasn't experimenting on them or using them for some grand plan. They were simply hers, and she was theirs, in a relationship that needed no more complexity than that. Like a parent with a child, she sheltered them in her light, and they thrived in her warmth. The land in those days, before the kingdom of Hallownest existed, was a very different place. There was no unified government, no sprawling cities, no grand architecture. Instead, there were scattered tribes living according to their natures. The Mantis tribe kept to their village in the fungal wastes, warriors who valued honour and isolation. The spider tribe wove their webs in deepness darkness, patient hunters who kept to themselves. The mushroom creatures flourished in their damp caverns, neither truly plant nor truly animal. And throughout it all, the moth tribe dwelt in their high places, dreaming their shared dreams. These tribes didn't war with each other, at least not in any organised way. There were territorial disputes certainly, and predators hunted prey as nature intended. But there was a kind of balance, a coexistence born not from diplomacy but from simple separation. Each tribe had its domain, its way of life, and rarely did these overlap enough to cause serious conflict. The world was large enough for everyone, and no one had yet conceived of the idea that it might be conquered or unified. For the creatures under Radiance's influence, existence was defined by feeling rather than thinking. They didn't ponder the meaning of life or wonder about their place in the cosmos. They simply lived, moment to moment, in a state of peaceful continuity. If you could step back to that time and experience it, you would feel a profound quietness, not the silence of absence, but the stillness of perfect contentment. Days passed like water flowing in a gentle stream, each one the same as the last, and that sameness was not boring but comforting. Nothing needed to change because everything was already exactly as it should be. This age of scattered peace would not last. Change was coming, as change always does, and this change would arrive in the form of a massive serpent, burrowing through the stone deep beneath the earth, carrying with it a vision of something the world had never seen, civilization itself. From the depths it came, tunneling through stone and earth, a creature of incomprehensible size and age. The worm was an ancient being, vast beyond measure, its body stretching through caverns and crevasses like a living mountain range. Where it had come from originally, no one knew. Perhaps even the worm itself had forgotten. It was old when the world was young, and it had seen the rise and fall of countless ages. But now the worm was travelling with purpose, burrowing through the deepest places toward a specific destination. It emerged finally at the edge of what would later be called the Kingdom's Edge, a desolate place of jagged cliffs and howling winds. And there, in that lonely place, the worm did something remarkable, something that only a higher being could do. It died, or rather, it transformed. The massive serpent body, hundreds of times larger than any structure in the future kingdom, went still. The life force within it began to concentrate, to compress, to reshape itself into something new. This wasn't death in any normal sense. It was metamorphosis, rebirth, a conscious choice to become something other than what it had been. The immense physical form was shed like an old skin, left behind as a shell, a husk, a monument to what once was. And from this death emerged something small by comparison but no less mighty, the Pale King. He was small enough to walk among the bugs, humanoid in shape, with a body of pure white chitin that seemed to glow faintly with its own inner light. His head bore a crown of horns, natural protrusions that marked him as royalty, as something beyond ordinary beings. His eyes, when he opened them for the first time in this new form, held intelligence, purpose, and a vision of the future. The Pale King looked upon the scattered tribes of Hallownest and saw potential. Where others saw bugs living by instinct, he saw minds waiting to be awakened. Where others saw chaos, he saw the possibility of order. Where others saw simplicity, he saw the opportunity for something grand, something magnificent, something that would last for ages and be remembered forever. His vision was of civilization, of cities with flowing fountains and magnificent architecture, of trade and culture, of bugs who could think and plan and create. He envisioned stagways connecting distant territories, allowing for travel and commerce. He imagined great halls of learning where knowledge could be preserved and expanded. He saw, in short, everything that the ancient world was not: progress, advancement, achievement. And he had the power to make this vision real. The Pale King's greatest gift, the thing that would change Hallownest forever, was sapience itself, the ability to think, to reason, to plan beyond simple instinct. This wasn't something he forced upon the bugs, not at first. It was something he offered, and the bugs, not knowing what they were accepting, took it eagerly. Imagine living your entire life guided purely by instinct, by patterns hardwired into your being. You know to burrow when the soil is soft, to seek shelter when danger approaches, to eat when hungry, to rest when tired. Your life is simple, uncomplicated, guided by drives you don't question, because you lack the capacity to question anything at all. And then suddenly, something changes. Suddenly you can think. Not just react, but actually think. You can look at a problem and conceive of multiple solutions. You can remember the past and use those memories to plan for the future. You can wonder why things are the way they are. You can imagine things that don't exist and then figure out how to create them. The world, which had always been a simple place of stimulus and response, suddenly becomes infinitely complex and infinitely fascinating. This is what the Pale King gave to the bugs of Hallownest, and they accepted it with wonder. A beetle who had only known how to dig suddenly understood geometry and could plan tunnels that wouldn't collapse. A bug who had only known how to gather food suddenly could think about storing it for lean times, about cultivating sources rather than simply finding them. Language became more complex, allowing for nuanced communication of abstract ideas. Culture began to form, traditions developed, society took shape. And with thinking came ambition. Bugs who could plan for the future naturally wanted that future to be better than the present. They wanted comfort, security, prosperity. They wanted to build things that would last, to create works that would be remembered. They wanted, in short, exactly what the Pale King was offering them, a place in something greater than themselves, a chance to be part of building a kingdom. The construction began almost immediately. The Pale King chose a central location, and there began to build his capital. The City of Tears rose from the stone, a marvel of architecture with buildings stacked upon buildings, with water flowing endlessly from some unseen source above, with light crystals illuminating the darkness. Stagways were carved through the earth, connecting distant regions and allowing for easy travel. The White Palace, the Pale King's own residence, began to take shape, a structure of such impossible precision and beauty that it seemed almost unreal, more dream than reality. Bugs flocked to this growing kingdom, drawn by the promise of order and purpose. The Pale King welcomed them all, granted them all the gift of thought, and put them to work building his vision. And the bugs, revelling in their newfound ability to think and create, worked willingly, even joyfully. They were part of something now, something grand and growing. They had purpose beyond simple survival. They had meaning. Hallownest expanded rapidly, growing from a single city to a vast underground kingdom. New districts emerged. The fungal wastes were connected by the stagways. Deepness was explored and mapped. The howling cliffs were charted. Everywhere the Pale King's influence reached, civilization followed. Buildings rose, roads were laid. Society organized itself into increasingly complex structures. It was a time of incredible energy and optimism. The bugs of Hallownest truly believed they were building something eternal, something that would last forever. But there was a cost to this progress, though few recognized it at the time. The Moth tribe, who had lived for so long in their peaceful dream connection with the Radiance, found themselves drawn to the Pale King's vision like all the others. And this is where the true tragedy begins, not with any act of violence or cruelty, but with the simple, gradual process of forgetting. You see, the Pale King's gifts were tangible, immediate, visible. He offered buildings you could touch, food you could eat, purposes you could fulfill. He offered a place in society, a role to play, work that would be remembered and valued. These were concrete things you could see and measure and point to with pride. Look, you could say, I helped build that. I was part of this. I matter. The Radiance's gifts, by contrast, were spiritual, internal, difficult to quantify. She offered connection, warmth, belonging, feelings that couldn't be pointed to or measured. She existed primarily in dreams, in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, where everything is fuzzy and unclear. How do you value a dream against a building? How do you weigh a feeling of connection against the pride of creation? How do you choose intangible peace over tangible progress? The moths didn't make this choice all at once. There was no moment where they gathered together and decided to abandon their goddess. Instead, it was a gradual cultural shift, so slow that no individual moth probably even noticed it was happening. They started spending more time on building projects and less time in meditation. They found themselves thinking about the new stagway being constructed and forgetting to enter the dream realm. They got caught up in the excitement of civilization, in learning new crafts and skills, in being part of something that felt immediate and real. The Pale King, whether intentionally or not, encouraged this forgetting. His entire vision was forward-looking, focused on progress and the future. He didn't speak of the old ways, didn't honour the traditions that came before him. Why would he? He was creating something new, something better. The past was instinct and simplicity. The future was thought and civilization. And the moths, like everyone else, were caught up in this vision of forward movement. Memory, you see, requires maintenance. A relationship requires attention. The connection the moths had with the Radiance wasn't some automatic thing that would continue forever without effort. It needed to be nurtured, practiced, remembered. And as they stopped practicing those meditations, stopped entering those dream spaces where she dwelled, the connection began to fray. Not break, not at first, just fray, like a rope slowly coming undone. It must have been like forgetting a name that was once familiar. You know you knew it once. You can almost remember it. It's right there on the tip of your tongue. But the harder you try to recall it, the further it slips away. The moths began to forget what it felt like to be connected to the Radiance. They remembered that they once worshipped something, once felt something, but the specific feeling grew harder to recall. And as it grew harder to recall, they tried less frequently to remember, and the forgetting accelerated. This is the saddest kind of betrayal. Not the dramatic kind where someone actively turns against you, but the quiet kind where they simply drift away. They don't hate you. They don't even dislike you. They just get busy with other things. And gradually you realize they're not thinking about you anymore. And by the time you notice, it's already too late. The connection is already too weak to maintain. The Radiance didn't abandon the moths. The moths didn't reject the Radiance. They just forgot her, slowly and sadly, until she was nothing more than a vague feeling of something lost, a nostalgia for a time they could no longer clearly remember. And in the world of higher beings, to be forgotten is to begin to die. But higher beings don't die easily, and they certainly don't die quickly. The Radiance didn't simply vanish when the moth stopped worshipping her. She couldn't. She was too powerful, too deeply woven into the fabric of reality itself. But she did begin to weaken, to fade, to become isolated in a way she had never experienced before. Trapped in the dream realm, she watched as her children forgot her. She could feel the connections severing one by one as moths stopped meditating, stopped dreaming, stopped reaching out to touch that shared consciousness that had once been their entire world. Imagine being able to see and hear people who can neither see nor hear you. Imagine watching them go about their lives, laughing and talking and building, while you stand invisible and silent, unable to make them notice you no matter how hard you try. The Radiance called out to them at first, gently, softly, the way she always had, but they didn't hear. They were too focused on their new lives, too caught up in the excitement of civilization. So she called louder, pushed harder against the barrier between the dream realm and the waking world. Still they didn't notice. Or if they did notice, they dismissed it as strange dreams, random neural firings, nothing important. You have to understand, the Radiance wasn't attacking yet. Not really. She was just trying to be remembered, trying to be seen again, like someone frantically waving their arms, trying to catch the attention of a friend who has walked past without noticing them. There was desperation in it, yes, but not yet anger. Just profound sadness, profound hurt, the ache of being abandoned by those you loved and protected. She must have felt betrayed, even though she understood on some level what was happening. She was a being of light and consciousness. She could see the appeal of what the Pale King was offering, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. Her children, the moths she had nurtured for countless generations, had chosen someone else, had chosen progress over peace, thought over feeling, civilization over connection. And she was left alone in the dream realm, fading slowly, watching her domain shrink as fewer and fewer minds reached out to touch it. Higher beings don't die from lack of worship, but they do weaken. Their influence diminishes, their power contracts, their ability to affect the physical world decreases. The Radiance felt herself becoming less substantial, less real, more like a memory than a being. And perhaps that's what she would become eventually, just a memory, a legend, a half-remembered myth about some goddess the moths once worshipped in ancient times. But the Radiance was not ready to fade quietly into oblivion. She had been forgotten, yes, but she still existed. She still had power, still had will, still had the blazing core of light that made her what she was. And as the sadness in her grew, as the loneliness deepened, something else began to grow alongside it. Anger. Not the hot, impulsive anger that burns bright and fast. No, this was something colder, deeper, more patient. The anger of the forgotten, the rejected, the abandoned. The anger that comes from watching others build their happiness on the grave of your relevance. The Radiance had been peaceful for ages beyond counting, had asked nothing of her children except that they remember her, stay connected to her, and they couldn't even do that. They had cast her aside like an old toy, something that had once brought comfort but was no longer needed. But a goddess does not fade quietly. A higher being does not simply accept oblivion. The Radiance began to realize that if the moths wouldn't remember her willingly, she would make them remember. If they wouldn't come to her in peace, she would reach into their minds by force. If the Pale King wanted their thoughts, wanted to fill their heads with his vision of progress and civilization, then she would fight him for those thoughts, would fill their minds with her light, whether they wanted it or not. It started small, as these things always do. A bug would sleep and have strange dreams. Not nightmares exactly, but unsettling visions. Bright light that hurt to look at. A sensation of something vast and powerful, trying to push its way into their mind. A feeling of being watched by something they couldn't see. They would wake confused, disturbed, unable to shake the sense that something was wrong. At first, these were isolated incidents, easily dismissed. Everyone has bad dreams sometimes, after all. The bugs of Hallownest, newly gifted with the ability to think and reason, simply rationalized it away. Too much work, they told themselves. Stress from the rapid expansion of the kingdom. The normal anxieties that come with living in a changing world. Nothing to worry about. They would go about their day, and by evening they'd almost forgotten the strangeness of the night before. But the dreams persisted, and gradually they became more intense, more frequent, harder to dismiss. Bugs began to dream of moths, of ancient temples, of a blazing presence that demanded recognition. They dreamed of memories that weren't theirs, or were they? Had there been something before the Pale King? Some presence they had known once? The dream stirred something in the depths of their minds, something that felt like remembering and forgetting at the same time. The Radiance was pushing through, you see, reaching from the dream realm into the sleeping minds of Hallownest citizens, trying to make herself known again. She wasn't subtle about it anymore. Subtlety had failed. Gentle calls had gone unanswered, so now she pushed harder, forced her way into their dreams, demanded that they see her, remember her, acknowledge that she still existed. For the bugs experiencing this, it was deeply uncomfortable. Imagine having someone else's memories suddenly appearing in your head. Imagine feeling emotions, longing, betrayal, anger, that aren't your own but that feel real nonetheless. Your mind knows something is wrong, that these thoughts aren't yours, but it can't stop them from appearing. You try to resist, but how do you resist a dream? How do you fight something that appears when you close your eyes? The moths, in particular, began to feel it strongly. They were her children after all, and the connection between them, though weakened, had never been completely severed. For them, the dreams came with a sense of profound guilt, like remembering a promise they'd broken, a loved one they'd abandoned. Some tried to return to the old ways, to meditate, to reach out to that presence they'd forgotten. But it had been too long. They couldn't quite grasp it anymore. The techniques had been lost, the knowledge forgotten. They could feel her there, pushing at their minds, but they couldn't connect in the old peaceful way. And then the dreams turned dark. What had been uncomfortable became frightening. The bright light in the dreams grew painful, scorching. The sense of a presence became a sense of invasion. Bugs began waking up screaming, thrashing, unable to distinguish dream from reality. Some stopped sleeping altogether, or tried to, which only made things worse. Sleep deprivation mixed with forced visions created a toxic combination. Bugs began seeing things while awake. Flashes of light, shadows that moved wrong, glimpses of something vast and terrible lurking just beyond perception. The Radiance wasn't trying to hurt them, not exactly. She was trying to be seen, to be remembered, to reclaim what had been taken from her. But her desperation had made her methods brutal. She was pushing too hard, forcing her way into minds that weren't prepared for it, that actively resisted it. And in that resistance, in that clash between her light and their unwillingness to accept it, something terrible was being born. The whispers grew louder, the dreams became screams, and in the waking world the first signs of infection began to appear. The infection, sometimes called the plague, was not a disease in any conventional sense. There was no virus, no bacteria, no physical pathogen that could be studied or treated with medicine. No, the infection was something far stranger and more insidious than that. It was the Radiance's light itself, forced into minds that couldn't contain it, leaked from the dream realm into physical reality where it had no business being. When you look at an infected bug, you see that distinctive orange glow emanating from their eyes, from cracks in their shell, sometimes seeping from their bodies like luminous fluid. That glow is her essence. her very being, trying to exist in a place it shouldn't. The dream realm and the physical world are meant to be separate, connected but distinct. The infection represented a breaking down of that barrier, a violent intrusion of one reality into another. And what did it do to the bugs it touched? It stripped away the very thing the Pale King had given them: sapience, the ability to think, to reason, to be more than instinct. The infection didn't kill in most cases, at least not immediately. Instead, it unmade minds. An infected bug lost their personality, their memories, their sense of self. They became something caught between two states, neither the simple, peaceful, instinctual creatures they had been before the Pale King, nor the thinking, planning beings they had become under his rule. Instead, they became violent, aggressive, mindless in a way that was worse than simple animal behavior, because there was intelligence there, but it was fragmented, broken, operating without coherence or purpose. They attacked anything that moved, driven by something that wasn't quite hunger, wasn't quite fear, but something like a scream made physical. They were, in essence, the physical manifestation of the Radiance's desperate rage. Light turned to heat, warmth turned to burning. The progression was horrible to witness. Maybe you knew someone, a friend, a neighbour, a family member. You'd notice them acting strangely at first, forgetting things, staring off into space, complaining of headaches, of a pressure behind their eyes. Then the orange glow would begin, faint at first, easily missed in bright light, then stronger, undeniable. And once the glow appeared, it was only a matter of time. They'd become aggressive, violent, attacking anyone nearby. Their speech, if they could still speak at all, would become nonsensical. Fragments of sentences, words that meant nothing, sometimes just meaningless sounds. Their movements would become erratic, purposeless, driven by something that wasn't will, but wasn't pure instinct either. It was corruption in the truest sense, a being transformed into something contrary to their nature, something wrong. If you used the dream nail on infected bugs, you could sometimes hear fragments of their thoughts, and what you heard was heartbreaking, confusion, fear, glimpses of who they used to be, trapped inside a body and mind they could no longer control. Some were aware, on some level, of what was happening to them, aware but helpless, watching themselves transformed into monsters while unable to stop it. Take Myla, the miner in the Crystal Peaks. Early on you can find her mining happily, singing a cheerful song about discovering sparkling stones. She's herself, a simple worker, content in her labour, enjoying the simple pleasure of her work. But if you return later, after the infection has spread, you find her still mining but changed. The orange glow surrounds her, her song is distorted, the words wrong, and if you approach too closely, she attacks mindlessly, driven by the infection to violence she would never have chosen. This is what the infection did. It took everything the Pale King had built, his vision of thinking, reasoning beings creating civilization, and unmade it. But it didn't return bugs to their original state of peaceful instinct. It trapped them in a nightmare middle ground, stripped of both thought and peace, leaving only violence and confusion. The infection spread through dreams first, but it didn't stay in dreams. It leaked into the physical world, turning the very air orange in heavily infected areas, coating surfaces with a luminous residue that seemed almost alive. At first, the Pale King and his court tried to contain it. Quarantines were established. Infected individuals were locked away, isolated from the healthy population. But how do you quarantine a plague that spreads through dreams? You can't separate sleeping minds. The infection found its way through the dream realm, touching any bug whose mental defences were weak, whose connection to the Pale King's gift of sapience was tenuous. The crossroads, a central hub connecting many of Hallownest districts, was hit particularly hard. This was a populated area, full of travellers and merchants, simple bugs living simple lives. They had no special defences against psychic invasion, no training in resisting mental influence. When the infection reached the crossroads, it spread like fire through dry grass. Within weeks, nearly every bug there showed signs of the orange glow. The busy, lively hub became a nightmare of violence and confusion. The City of Tears, despite its greater organisation and the presence of the Pale King's most loyal subjects, wasn't spared. The infection crept through even there, touching merchants, guards, scholars. Even the strong-willed, even those most devoted to the Pale King, proved vulnerable. Strength of body meant nothing against this. Intelligence meant nothing. The Radiance wasn't attacking bodies. She was attacking minds themselves, and every mind was vulnerable. Even the kingdom's warriors, its most skilled fighters, found themselves helpless. The 5 great knights, legendary heroes who had served the Pale King in establishing his kingdom, could do nothing. They could face any physical threat without fear. But what use is a sword against a dream? What use is armour against something that attacks from inside your own mind? The panic spread as quickly as the infection itself. Families locked themselves in their homes, afraid to venture out, afraid to sleep. But locking doors couldn't keep out something that travelled through dreams. Not sleeping only delayed the inevitable. Eventually, exhaustion would claim everyone, and when they finally collapsed into slumber, the Radiance would be waiting. Businesses closed. The stagways fell silent. Districts that as once bustled with activity became ghost towns, with only the infected wandering through, attacking anything that moved. The great construction project stopped, half-finished structures standing as monuments to interrupted ambition. The kingdom that had seemed so eternal, so unshakable, began to crumble under the weight of a plague that couldn't be fought, couldn't be cured, couldn't even be properly understood. Every solution the Pale King tried proved useless. His greatest scholars studied the infection, trying to understand its mechanism, looking for some way to stop it. But how do you study something that exists primarily in dreams? How do you develop a cure for something that isn't a physical illness? The scholars could observe the effects, could document the progression, but they couldn't find the cause in any material sense. The knights tried to fight it force. They hunted down infected bugs, put them down before they could spread the infection further. But this accomplished nothing. The infection didn't spread through physical contact. Killing the infected didn't slow it down because new cases kept appearing, emerging from the dream realm rather than from contact with other infected bugs. Some tried suppressing sleep, developing elixirs and techniques to keep bugs awake for longer periods, but this only made things worse. Sleep-deprived bugs became easier targets, not harder. Their mental defences weakened from exhaustion, making them more susceptible to the Radiance's influence, not less. And eventually everyone had to sleep. The body demanded it. And when they finally collapsed from exhaustion, their minds were so vulnerable that the infection took hold immediately. Physical barriers failed. Mental defences failed. Medicine failed. Magic failed. Everything failed. The Pale King, for all his power and wisdom, for all his vision and planning, could not find a way to stop the Radiance. He could build kingdoms, grant sapience, create marvels of architecture and organization. But he couldn't fight a battle that took place in the dream realm, couldn't combat an enemy who attacked from a place he couldn't reach. The problem was fundamental. The Radiance existed primarily in the dream realm, and from there she was essentially untouchable. You can't kill what lives in dreams. You can't wound something that has no physical form. You can't imprison something that exists in a space beyond physical locks and chains. She was there, in the dream realm, pushing her influence into the physical world, and there was no way to stop her without entering that realm yourself. And so the Pale King, watching his kingdom die, realized he needed something radical, something that had never been tried before, something that would be, by any moral standard, monstrous. He couldn't fight the Radiance where she was. He couldn't protect his subjects' minds from invasion. But perhaps he could create something that had no mind to invade, something empty, hollow, a perfect void where the Radiance's light would find no purchase, something that could serve as a container, a prison, a living seal. The logic was sound in its cold, calculated way. The Radiance infected through thought, through consciousness, through the very sapience the Pale King had granted. She reached into minds and took hold, using memories and emotions and thoughts as handholds to pull herself from the dream realm into physical reality. So the solution seemed clear. Create a being with no mind for it to infect. A perfect void, a complete emptiness, a container with nothing inside that she could grasp. But how do you create such a thing? Living beings, by their nature, have some form of consciousness, some spark of life and awareness. Even the simplest bug has instincts, drives, some dim awareness of its own existence. Creating true emptiness, true hollowness, would require something unprecedented. It would require combining life with its opposite, merging the living with the void itself. The void was the ancient opposite of the Radiance's light. Where she was warmth and connection and consciousness, the void was cold and isolation and absolute emptiness. It existed in the deepest places of the earth, pooled in an ancient abyss far beneath Hallownest. The civilization that had once wielded the void was long gone, but their experiments remained, and the Pale King had studied them. He understood what the void was and what it could do. His plan was this: create children, his own offspring, but birth them into the void itself, so that from their first moment of existence they would be filled not with life but with emptiness. They would have the shell of living things, the form of bugs, but inside they would be hollow, devoid of thought or will or emotion. Perfect emptiness in a living form. And one of these vessels, the most perfect one, could serve as a container for the Radiance herself. She could be drawn into it, trapped within this hollow shell, sealed away from the dream realm and imprisoned in a walking prison that gave her nothing to infect because there was nothing there to infect. It was brilliant. It was logical. It was necessary, perhaps the only solution that could work, and it was absolutely monstrous. The Pale King knew what he was proposing. He was a being of immense intelligence, capable of seeing the implications of his choices. He knew he was proposing to create thousands of his own children, not to love them or raise them or watch them grow, but to use them as experimental subjects, testing each one for perfect hollowness and discarding the failures. He was proposing to treat his own offspring as tools, as things rather than beings, as means to an end rather than ends in themselves. But what choice did he have? His kingdom was dying. His subjects were being transformed into mindless husks, their minds devoured by a vengeful goddess. Every day more bugs fell to the infection. Every day more of his vision crumbled. Traditional solutions had all failed. This was the only path forward he could see, the only hope for saving what remained of Hallownest. The moral weight of this decision must have been crushing, but the Pale King was a being who valued order, civilization, the greater good. He could sacrifice anything for his kingdom, even his own children. He would bear the guilt, carry the horror of what he was about to do, if it meant saving the thousands of innocent bugs who had trusted him to protect them. Deep beneath Hallownest, far below even the deepest inhabited areas, there was a place called the Abyss. It was a chasm of impossible depth, its bottom lost in darkness so complete that light itself seemed to die upon entering, and at the lowest point anyone had ever reached, there pooled the void itself. Liquid darkness, pure emptiness given physical form. It moved like water, but was darker than any shadow, a substance that seemed to absorb not just light, but meaning itself. This is where the Pale King went, accompanied by the White Lady, his queen. Together, they would create the vessels. The White Lady laid eggs, thousands of them, in the abyss itself, so that when the eggs hatched, the newborn creatures would emerge directly into that liquid darkness. Imagine being born into absolute emptiness. No warmth, no light, no comfort. The first sensation of existence being the cold embrace of the void seeping into you, filling you, replacing whatever spark of life might have ignited with pure nothingness. These children were born hollow, shaped by the void from their first moment, their shells forming around emptiness rather than consciousness. They looked like small versions of the Pale King himself, tiny figures with white masks and horns, though their bodies were black as the void that filled them. They had the form of living things, but lacked their essence. No voice to cry out with, no will to guide their actions, no mind to think thoughts, just hollow shells, animated by something that wasn't quite life, and wasn't quite unlife, something in between. Thousands of them. Thousands of these small hollow children hatching in the darkness, pulling themselves from the void, climbing up toward a light they couldn't comprehend because they lacked the consciousness to comprehend anything. And the Pale King watched. He observed each one, testing them, looking for signs of thought or will. Because here was the terrible irony. Perfect hollowness was incredibly difficult to achieve. Even beings born in the void, filled with emptiness from birth, could develop some spark of consciousness. Life wants to be alive. Awareness wants to emerge. Most failed the test. Most showed some sign of self-awareness, some hint of thought or feeling. A vessel that hesitated before following a command. Failure. A vessel that showed curiosity about its surroundings. Failure. A vessel that exhibited any behavior that couldn't be explained by simple programming. Failure. And what happened to the failures? They were cast back into the abyss, left to fall back into the darkness, discarded like broken tools. The abyss filled with these cast-off children, thousands of them piling up at the bottom, their small broken shells lying in heaps. Some may have still been alive, if you could call it life, trapped in the darkness, unable to climb back up. What happened in the abyss was one of the saddest things in Hallownest's history. Thousands of children created not to be loved, but to be tested and discarded. Thousands of small beings who might have been people if given the chance, instead cast into darkness because they showed signs of being alive. But let's return to the logic of it, because understanding why this seemed necessary helps us comprehend the full tragedy. The Radiance operated through consciousness. She was a being of light and thought, existing primarily in the realm of dreams and minds. Everything about her was mental, psychic, operating on the level of awareness and thought. To control someone, she needed something in their mind to grab onto. Thoughts, memories, emotions, any form of consciousness. A perfectly hollow vessel would give her nothing. It would be like trying to grab water with a net. The Radiance could pour her light into such a being, could try to infect it, but there would be nothing there to infect. The light would find only emptiness, only void, which was fundamentally opposed to and incompatible with her essence. So a perfect vessel could serve as an ideal prison. The Radiance could be drawn into it, pulled from the dream realm and trapped within this physical form, and once inside, she would find herself contained within a being that gave her nothing to work with. No consciousness to corrupt, no mind to control. Finally, after thousands of attempts, one vessel climbed out of the abyss and seemed perfect. It showed no signs of thought, no evidence of will, no spark of consciousness. It responded to commands with perfect obedience. It performed tasks without hesitation or deviation. It seemed, by every test the Pale King could devise, to be completely and utterly hollow. This vessel was chosen. Taken from the abyss, brought to the White Palace, given the name, or title, that would define its existence, the Hollow Knight. It was raised, in whatever sense a hollow being can be raised, in the sterile perfection of the White Palace. The Pale King trained it personally, teaching it combat techniques despite it supposedly having no mind to learn with. The Hollow Knight grew larger, stronger. It learned to fight with remarkable skill, mastering techniques that should have required conscious thought and adaptation. It became a formidable warrior, perhaps one of the finest fighters in all of Hallownest. And through all of this it never spoke, never showed emotion, never exhibited any behaviour that suggested it was anything but an empty shell, animated by simple programming. There's a secret area in the White Palace, a place called the Path of Pain. If you make it through to the end, you're rewarded with something more valuable than any treasure, a memory. You see the Pale King standing beside a small figure, the Hollow Knight when it was young, just a small vessel freshly chosen from the abyss, and the Pale King is looking at it, just looking. But there's something in that look, something in his posture that suggests emotion, care perhaps, pride, maybe even something approaching love. This was the fatal flaw. The Pale King, for all his power and wisdom, for all his cold calculation and willingness to sacrifice, was still a father looking at his child. And the Hollow Knight, for all its supposed emptiness, was still a child in the presence of its father. And between them, despite all precautions, despite all intentions, a bond formed. The Hollow Knight developed one idea, one single concept in whatever passed for its mind: duty to the Pale King. Not a complex thought, not a rich emotional life, just the simple notion that it existed to serve its father, to fulfill the purpose it has been created for. This was enough. This tiny imperfection, this microscopic crack in its hollowness, would prove to be the kingdom's doom. Perfect hollowness was impossible. The Pale King had tried to create something that went against the fundamental nature of existence. Life wants to be alive. Consciousness wants to emerge. Connection wants to form. You cannot create a being and interact with it without forming some kind of bond, no matter how minimal. Love, even unintentional, even one-sided, even unconscious, creates a crack in emptiness. But the Pale King didn't know. Or perhaps he knew but had no choice but to proceed anyway. The infection was still spreading. The kingdom was still dying. Even an imperfect vessel was better than no solution at all. The Hollow Knight could serve as a container for the Radiance, but a container without a lock is worthless. The Radiance was a higher being of immense power. Even trapped within a vessel, she would eventually find some way to escape unless the prison was sealed absolutely. The Pale King needed locks, powerful magical seals that would keep the Radiance bound within the Hollow Knight indefinitely. He found 3 volunteers, 3 loyal subjects willing to sacrifice everything for their kingdom, 3 bugs who understood what was being asked of them and accepted it anyway, because they believed Hallownest was worth saving. Monomon the teacher was a brilliant scholar, perhaps the greatest intellect in Hallownest after the Pale King himself. She lived in the archives, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of the kingdom, always seeking to understand more, to learn more, to push the boundaries of what was known. She was curious by nature, driven by an insatiable desire to discover and comprehend. To ask her to sleep forever, to stop learning, to remain in stasis for eternity. It was like asking her to die while still alive. But she understood the necessity. The kingdom that had given her the opportunity to learn, the civilization that had made scholarship possible, was dying. If her eternal sleep could save it, then she would sleep. Lurien the Watcher was the protector of the City of Tears, a silent guardian who observed the city from his high spire, ever vigilant for threats. He was devoted to the city, to its people, to the preservation of the order and beauty the Pale King had created. His whole purpose was watching, protecting, being ready to defend against any danger. To sleep was to fail in that purpose, to abandon his post, to leave the city unguarded. But he understood that the greatest threat to the city wasn't something he could fight with vigilance. It was the infection itself. And if sleeping could help seal that threat away, then he would close his eyes and trust others to watch in his place. Hera the Beast was the queen of the spider tribe in Deepnest, a fierce and independent ruler who had never fully accepted the Pale King's authority. She ruled her own territory, kept her own council, and the Pale King had learned to respect her autonomy rather than try to force her submission. When he came to ask for her help, she made a condition. In exchange for her sacrifice, the Pale King would give her a child. Not a vessel, a real child, born of his essence but not hollow, not void-touched, a living being who could inherit her throne and rule the spiders after she was gone. The Pale King agreed, and so Hornet was born, daughter of the Pale King and Hera, not hollow but fully alive, bound to both Hallownest and Deepnest. These 3 agreed to become dreamers, to enter into a magical sleep from which they would never wake. Their sleeping forms would serve as seals, locks on the prison that held the Radiance. Only if all 3 were killed would the seals break and the prison open. They were, in essence, agreeing to die without dying, to exist in a state of perpetual unconsciousness, sacrificing not just their lives, but their very ability to experience life. The tragedy of their sacrifice is profound. These were people with hopes, with purposes, with lives they valued. Monomon would never learn another fact, never solve another mystery. Lurien would never again see the city he loved from his spire, never again watch over the citizens he devoted himself to protecting. Hera would never see her daughter grow up, never teach her what she knew, never pass on the traditions of the spider tribe to her heir. But they did it anyway, because they believed in Hallownest, because they trusted the Pale King, because they understood that sometimes survival requires sacrifice, and they were willing to be the ones sacrificed. Everything was prepared. The Hollow Knight stood ready, an empty vessel waiting to be filled. The three dreamers lay in their chambers preparing to enter their eternal sleep. The Black Egg Temple had been constructed, a massive sealed chamber where the Hollow Knight would be imprisoned, chained and bound, locked away from the world. The ritual began. Through methods not fully explained, the Radiance was drawn from the dream realm. She must have fought it, resisted with all her power. But the combination of forces arrayed against her was too strong. The Pale King's will, the void within the Hollow Knight, the power of the three dreamers, together they pulled her from her realm and forced her into the vessel prepared for her. Imagine the sensation for the Radiance. She was a being of light and consciousness, used to existing in the infinite space of the dream realm, where she could spread out, expand, touch as many minds as she wished. And suddenly she found herself compressed, forced into a physical form, trapped within a hollow shell that gave her nothing to work with. It must have been like being buried alive, compressed, constrained, sealed within darkness. The Hollow Knight walked into the Black Egg Temple. Did it know what was happening? Did it understand it would never leave? Impossible to say. It had no voice to protest with, and even if it had thoughts, it would never express them. It simply walked into that massive chamber, stood in the position it had been taught to stand in, and waited. Chains emerged from the ground and walls, binding the Hollow Knight in place. These weren't ordinary chains, but something magical, something that could hold not just a physical form, but the power contained within it. The Hollow Knight was secured, immobilized, made unable to move even if it wanted to. And then the three dreamers entered their sleep. Monomen in her archives, surrounded by the knowledge she would never again study. Lurien in his spire, his last sight the city he would never again watch over. Hera in Deepnest, leaving behind a daughter she would never see again. All three closed their eyes and entered the deepest sleep imaginable, their consciousness withdrawn into dreams so profound that nothing could wake them. As they slept, the seals activated. The entrance to the Black Egg Temple sealed itself, massive doors closing and then disappearing into the stone. The Hollow Knight was locked inside, alone in the darkness, bound in chains, holding within itself the Radiance's burning light. For a moment, silence. The infection, which had been spreading unchecked throughout Hallownest, suddenly stopped. The orange glow faded from infected bugs. Those who had been in the early stages of infection recovered, confused and shaken, but themselves again. The more advanced cases remained infected, their minds too far gone to recover, but at least they were no longer violent. The Radiance's influence was cut off, leaving them passive husks rather than aggressive threats. Success. The plan had worked. The Radiance was sealed away. The infection was stopped. Hallownest had been saved. Hallownest celebrated. Not loudly. Too much had been lost for loud celebration, but quietly, with relief and gratitude and renewed hope. The kingdom had survived. it could continue. A fountain was built in the City of Tears, a beautiful monument honouring the sacrifice of the Hollow Knight and the three dreamers. Water flowed endlessly, a symbol of life continuing, of the kingdom's resilience. Bugs would come to this fountain and remember those who had given everything so that Hallownest could survive. Life continued. The stagways reopened, trade resumed. The City of Tears began to bustle again with commerce and culture. Scholars in the archives returned to their studies. The knights resumed their patrols. Everywhere, bugs returned to their lives, grateful for the chance to experience normal existence again after the horror of the infection. The Pale King sealed the abyss. He locked away that terrible place where the vessels had been created, presumably so that no one would discover what had happened there, so that the thousands of failed vessels lying at the bottom would remain hidden. The White Lady withdrew from public life, binding herself in roots within the Queen's gardens, taking on the guilt of what they had done, carrying the weight of all those discarded children. Everything seemed stable. The kingdom was recovering, the infection was gone, the Radiance was sealed away, presumably forever. The plan had worked. The sacrifice had been worth it. Hallownest would endure. For a while it seemed like this might be true. The kingdom prospered. Years passed without incident. The memory of the infection began to fade, becoming a dark period in history that the kingdom had survived and moved past. New generations were born who never knew the terror of the plague, who only knew the stories told by their elders. But inside the Black Egg Temple, in the darkness, bound in chains, the Hollow Knight sat motionless, and within it the Radiance burned, compressed, constrained, contained but not destroyed, still conscious, still aware, still desperately seeking escape, and working, slowly and patiently, at that tiny crack in the Hollow Knight's hollowness. Time is strange for immortal beings, for the Pale King, for the White Lady, for the Radiance herself. Time moves differently when you've lived for ages. Years that seem long to mortals pass like moments. Decades flow by like water. The kingdom continued. Generations of bugs lived their lives, born and died, without knowing that beneath their feet, locked away in darkness, a goddess was trapped and waiting. The Black Egg Temple became just another part of the landscape, a sealed ancient structure that no one thought much about anymore. Inside the temple, the Hollow Knight remained motionless, standing in its chains. No food, no water, no sleep. It needed none of these things. It was hollow after all, a void given form requiring nothing. It simply stood there, existing, fulfilling the purpose it had been created for, containing the Radiance. But the Radiance did not rest. She couldn't. She was trapped, yes, but she was still a higher being of immense power, and she had found that crack, that tiny imperfection in the Hollow Knight's hollowness, the idea of duty, the bond with the Pale King, the smallest hint of consciousness that shouldn't have been there. She worked at it, not with hands. She was trapped and had no physical form anyway, but with her essence, her will, her desperate need to escape. She pushed against that crack, widened it microscopically, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. It was slow work, impossibly slow, but she had nothing but time. And she was patient in the way that only the desperate can be patient. The Hollow Knight couldn't cry out, couldn't warn anyone that something was wrong. It had no voice. It stood in silence, motionless, while inside the Radiance worked at the growing flaw in its containment. Eventually, inevitably, the seal began to fail. The infection, which had been completely contained, began to leak. Just a little at first, a few bugs having strange dreams again, nothing serious. But then more. The orange glow appeared again in the crossroads, then in other areas. The infection was returning. Inside the Black Egg Temple, orange light began to seep through cracks in the Hollow Knight's shell. The Radiance's essence, contained for so long, was finding ways out. The Hollow Knight's shell, never meant to hold such power indefinitely, was breaking down under the strain. For the Hollow Knight, this must have been agony. Assuming it could feel anything, assuming there was enough consciousness in it to experience suffering. And there must have been, because it was that consciousness that allowed the Radiance to break through in the first place. Then the Hollow Knight experienced decades of silent torment, trapped inside its own body, unable to move, unable to speak, feeling the Radiance's burning light pressing outward against its shell, feeling itself crack and break under the strain. It couldn't cry out for help. It couldn't explain what was happening. It couldn't even fall or collapse. The chains held it upright, forced it to remain standing even as it failed in its purpose. The second outbreak of infection was worse than the first, because this time there was no hope of stopping it. The Pale King's great solution had failed. His terrible sacrifice, his monstrous creation of the vessels, his imprisonment of the Radiance, all of it had brought only temporary respite. The infection was back, and this time there was no plan, no solution waiting to be implemented. The Pale King disappeared. The circumstances are unclear, lost to history, or perhaps deliberately obscured. The White Palace itself was moved into the dream realm, pulled out of physical reality entirely, leaving behind only ruins and memories. Whether this was intentional or a consequence of the Pale King's disappearance, no one knows. But the ruler of Hallownest, the being whose vision had created the kingdom in the first place, was simply gone. The White Lady remained in her gardens, bound by roots, but she took no action. She could do nothing. Her role in the terrible plan was finished, and all that remained was to bear the guilt of what she had helped create. Citizens of Hallownest succumbed to the infection in growing numbers. The City of Tears, once bustling with life, became progressively emptier, as its residents either fled or fell to the plague. The crossroads, already damaged from the first outbreak, turned completely orange, every bug there transformed into violent, mindless husks. The kingdom's infrastructure began to fail as there was no one left to maintain it. The kingdom fell into ruin slowly, like a building collapsing in slow motion. Businesses closed permanently. Homes were abandoned. The stagways fell silent, no longer carrying travellers, but only the shambling forms of the infected. The really tragic part is how quiet it was. There were no great battles, no dramatic last stands. The kingdom simply emptied. Bugs left if they could, seeking safety in isolated corners of the kingdom or beyond its borders. Those who couldn't leave either fell to the infection or locked themselves away, hoping to survive until... what? There were no solution coming. No hero was going to save them. The Pale King was gone, the Hollow Knight had failed, and the Radiance's revenge was finally complete. Hallownest became a tomb, a vast underground kingdom filled with empty buildings and infected husks, a monument to ambition and failure. In the ruins, one figure remained active, neither fled nor infected. Hornet, the daughter of Hera and the Pale King. Born as the price of a sacrifice, she wandered the fallen kingdom alone. Her mother was asleep, sealed away as one of the dreamers, unreachable. Her father was gone, vanished without explanation. The kingdom she was born into had collapsed around her, but Hornet didn't leave. She stayed in Hallownest, watching, waiting, protecting what little remained. Perhaps she stayed out of duty. She was royalty after all, daughter of two kingdoms, Hallownest and Deepnest. Perhaps she felt responsible for what remained. Perhaps she was waiting for her mother to wake up, not understanding that Hera could never wake while the seal remained intact. Perhaps she was simply too stubborn to abandon the place she was born, even if that place had become a graveyard. She fought the infected when they crossed her path, her needle flashing in the darkness. She kept certain paths clear, certain areas relatively safe. She watched for threats, for changes, for anything that might indicate the situation was getting worse or impossibly better. And then, one day, something did change. A small figure appeared in Dirtmouth, the village at Hallownest's highest point. A tiny bug in a black cloak carrying a nail, wearing a white mask with horns that marked it unmistakably as one of the vessels. This was the Night, one of the thousands of vessels created in the abyss and then discarded. This vessel had somehow escaped the abyss years ago, had climbed out during the chaos of the kingdom's first collapse, had wandered away into the wilds beyond Hallownest's borders. It had lost its memory, or perhaps had never had memories to begin with. It wandered for years, decades, existing in the world outside Hallownest without purpose or direction. But something called it back. Some voice it couldn't quite hear, some pull it couldn't quite resist. It returned to Hallownest, descended into the ruins, began its journey through the fallen kingdom. It didn't know why. It couldn't have explained its purpose, even if it had possessed a voice to explain with. It simply felt drawn back to this place, compelled to descend into the depths, driven by something it couldn't name. As it travelled through Hallownest, the Night fought infected creatures, explored abandoned areas, slowly grew stronger through gathering charms and abilities. It was hollow, or close to hollow, perhaps even more perfectly hollow than the Hollow Knight had been, because it had been discarded, had never known the Pale King's attention, had never formed that bond that created the fatal flaw. Hornet encountered the Night multiple times, testing it, watching it, trying to understand what it was and what it intended. She fought the Night, not to kill it, but to measure its strength, to see if this small vessel might be capable of something. The Night continued deeper. It defeated the infected across Hallownest, pushed through obstacles, overcame challenges. It gathered ancient abilities, the ability to dash, to wall jump, to dive through breakable floors. It acquired spells that let it blast enemies with soul energy. It grew in power, became formidable despite its small size, and eventually, inevitably, the Night made its way toward the Three Dreamers. Because the only way to reach the Hollow Knight, the only way to address the source of the infection, was to break the seals. And breaking the seals meant killing the dreamers who had slept for decades to keep the prison locked. One by one, the Night defeated the Three Dreamers, or rather not defeated, killed. They were defenseless, trapped in their eternal sleep, unable to resist or fight back. The Night simply entered their chambers and used the Dream Nail, a mystical weapon that could pierce through dreams to end their sleep permanently. Monomon the teacher, surrounded by her archives, her lifelong pursuit of knowledge finally ended. Lurien the Watcher, in his spire above the City of Tears, his eternal vigil finally finished. Hera the Beast, in the depths of Deepnest, released at last from the bargain she had made, but also separated forever from the daughter who had been the price of that bargain. Each death broke a seal. Each seal breaking brought the night closer to the Black Egg Temple. Finally, all 3 seals were broken. The entrance to the Black Egg Temple, sealed for decades, cracked open. Massive doors that had been hidden in stone reappeared, then slowly, heavily swung open. For the first time since the Hollow Knight had walked inside all those years ago, the temple's interior was accessible. The knight entered. Inside, the temple was vast and dark, lit only by the orange glow of infection that permeated everything. And there, in the centre, standing motionless in chains, was the Hollow Knight. The Hollow Knight was larger than the small knight who had come to face it. Much larger, grown to full adult size during its decades of imprisonment. Its white shell was cracked, with orange light blazing from the wounds. Its head hung low, horns pointing downward, the posture of exhaustion or defeat. The chains held it upright, but it was clear that without them it would have collapsed long ago. As the knight approached, the Hollow Knight's head lifted, its empty eyes fixed on its sibling. And then, with tremendous effort, it raised its nail, not to attack exactly, to defend, to drive the knight away. Because even now, even failing in its purpose, even broken and corrupted, the Hollow Knight was still trying to protect the kingdom, still trying to fulfill its duty, still trying to keep others away from the Radiance trapped within it. The battle began. It was a sad, desperate fight. The Hollow Knight attacking with everything it had, despite being chained, despite the infection burning through it. It moved with skill, with techniques that proved it had genuinely learned combat, that it had never been truly hollow. Each strike it made was an attempt to drive away the only being who might be able to end this nightmare. The knight fought back, dodging the Hollow Knight's attacks, striking when openings appeared. Every blow it landed on its sibling was necessary but tragic. As the fight continued, the Hollow Knight's movements became more erratic, more desperate. It began to stab itself with its own nail, trying to contain the radiance, trying to stop the orange light from leaking out. The sight was heartbreaking. This being literally fighting against itself, trying to fulfill its purpose even as it failed, trying to be the perfect empty container it had never quite managed to be. And then Hornet arrived. She appeared in the temple, her needle drawn, and she helped restrain the Hollow Knight. Not to hurt it, but to hold it still, to give the knight the opening it needed. The Hollow Knight, restrained, stopped struggling. It hung in its chains, exhausted, broken, defeated. The orange light blazed from its wounds, the Radiance's power barely contained anymore, and the knight, facing its sibling, raised the Dream Nail. The Dream Nail was a strange weapon, created long ago for purposes now forgotten. It could cut through the barrier between the physical world and the dream realm, could pierce into minds and memories and dreams. The knight drove the Dream Nail into the Hollow Knight's mask, not to hurt it, but to enter it, to pass through the physical shell into the dream space within. The world changed. The Black Egg Temple disappeared, replaced by something else entirely. The night found itself in a void of pure white, a space of light so bright it should have been blinding. Platforms of what looked like solidified light hung in the emptiness, providing places to stand, and in the distance, a brightness that hurt to look at, a blazing presence that dominated the entire space. This was inside the Hollow Knight's mind, or what passed for its mind. This was the space where the Radiance had been trapped for decades, confined within the vessel's hollow shell. And now that shell was failing, the containment breaking down, and the Radiance was nearly free. She descended from the brightness above, and for the first time the Radiance appeared in her true form. She was massive, a moth of pure blazing light, larger than any normal creature, radiating power that made the air itself seem to shimmer. Her wings were vast and luminous, spread wide, casting light in all directions. Her body was pure white, almost painful to look at directly, glowing with an intensity that suggested barely contained power. But her most striking feature was her eyes, or rather the pattern on her face that resembled eyes. Huge, blazing orbs of light that fixed on the night with intelligence and rage and desperation all mixed together. And above her head, like a crown, spikes of light radiated outward, marking her as the higher being she was, the ancient goddess who'd been worshipped for ages. She was beautiful in the way that fire is beautiful, in the way that lightning is beautiful, dangerous, powerful, awe-inspiring. But there was also something sad about her appearance, something that spoke of long imprisonment, of desperate rage born from abandonment. She had been magnificent once, in the days when the moths worshipped her freely. Now she was still magnificent, but it was the magnificence of a caged sun, of light compressed and corrupted by its confinement. She didn't speak, or if she did, it wasn't in any language made of words. But her intention was clear. She must not go quietly back into imprisonment. She would not accept being forgotten again. If she couldn't have her worshippers' love, she would settle for their fear. If she couldn't be remembered fondly, she would ensure she was remembered at all. She was fighting for her very existence, because to be forgotten completely was a fate worse than death for a higher being. The Radiance was rage and light and desperate survival instinct given form. The battle began. The Radiance attacked with beams of pure light, with platforms that tried to crush the night, with swords made of concentrated radiance that shot up from below. The night dodged and weaved, struck when it could, slowly chipping away at the goddess's health. It was a desperate fight, the tiniest vessel against the most powerful higher being, void against light, emptiness against consciousness. The Radiance's attacks grew more desperate as the battle progressed. She wasn't used to being hurt. Higher beings don't experience physical damage in any normal sense. But whatever power the night possessed was working. She was weakening, her light dimming slightly, her movements becoming more frantic, and then something changed. The white void around them began to darken. Black began seeping in from below, shadows rising up through the platforms of light. The Radiance looked down, and for the first time in the battle something like fear crossed her blazing features. The void was rising. Not just the night's void, but all of it. The void from the abyss, the darkness that had been sealed away, the emptiness that had filled thousands of failed vessels. And more than that, those vessels themselves were rising. All the siblings, all the discarded children who had been cast into the abyss and left to pile up in the darkness, were answering their siblings' call. Thousands of shades emerged from the darkness, small shadowy figures with white masks, the spirits or essences of all the failed vessels. They'd been lying in the abyss for decades, discarded and forgotten, but they weren't dead. Not really. They were void, and void doesn't die easily. Now they rose together, united by some connection they shared with the night, drawn by the battle taking place in the dream realm, coming to support the one sibling who had made it to this point. The Radiance tried to fight them off, blasting them with her light, but there were too many, thousands of them, all reaching upward, all grasping for her. The void rose like a tide, like a wave of pure darkness washing over the bright space, and the Radiance was caught in it. She struggled, her light blazing even brighter for a moment, fighting against the darkness with everything she had. But darkness is patient. Emptiness is relentless. The void kept rising, kept pulling her down, countless shadowy tendrils wrapping around her form, dragging her toward the darkness below. The Radiance screamed, not with a voice, but with pure light and sound, a blast of radiant energy that briefly drove back the void. But it wasn't enough. She was surrounded, overwhelmed by the combined presence of the night and all its siblings, by the void itself rising up to consume the light that had been forced into it. The void pulled her down. Tendrils of pure darkness wrapped around the Radiance's glowing form, constraining her, compressing her light. She struggled magnificently, blazing brighter than she had in centuries, fighting with every ounce of power she possessed. For a moment she was glorious again, burning like the sun she'd been compared to, a goddess in her full power, refusing to submit to the darkness. But the void was stronger, or perhaps not stronger, but more persistent, more patient, more inevitable. Light can be extinguished, but emptiness is eternal. The tendrils tightened, pulling her deeper into the darkness. Her light began to flicker, to dim, to compress under the pressure of the void surrounding her. She was being consumed, not just defeated or destroyed, but truly consumed, her essence absorbed into the void, light swallowed by darkness. This wasn't like the ceiling. This was final. This was true death, the kind of death that even higher beings can experience when their very essence is unmade. The Radiance's form began to break apart. Fragments of light separated from her body, dispersing into the darkness and winking out one by one. Her wings, so vast and magnificent, crumbled into particles of fading luminescence. Her body dissolved, her light scattered, her presence shattered into increasingly small pieces until there was nothing left to break. And then, with one final pulse of brilliance, a last desperate attempt to exist, to be remembered, to not fade into complete oblivion, the Radiance was gone. The light that had burned for ages, that had created the moth tribe, that had connected minds across the dream realm, that had blazed in desperate rage when forgotten, that had plagued a kingdom out of loneliness and betrayal, that light went out. The space that had been filled with her blazing presence became dark. The white void turned black. The Radiance, the ancient goddess, the higher being who had existed since time immemorial, ceased to be, not sealed, not imprisoned, but truly, finally, absolutely destroyed. In the dream realm, in the physical world, everywhere her influence had reached, the light faded. It was over. The Radiance was gone. The moment the Radiance died, the infection ended. Instantly, completely, everywhere at once. The orange glow that had permeated so much of Hallownest simply disappeared, fading like morning mist. Infected bugs throughout Hallownest suddenly stopped moving. The violent aggression that had driven them ceased instantly. Some collapsed where they stood, their bodies giving out after being puppeted for so long. Others stood still, confused, awakening as if from a nightmare, and not understanding where they were or how they had gotten there. Those who had been infected but retained enough of themselves were freed. They woke up as if from the deepest sleep, disoriented and shaken, but themselves again. The orange light that had coated surfaces that had hung in the air like luminous fog vanished. The crossroads, so long bathed in that sickly glow, became dark again. Just normal darkness, the kind that didn't corrupt or infect, the kind that was just the absence of light rather than the presence of something wrong. Throughout the kingdom, bugs who had been hiding, who had locked themselves away to avoid infection, cautiously emerged. They looked around at a world suddenly quiet, suddenly peaceful, suddenly normal. The nightmare that had dominated their lives for so long was simply over. The plague that had seemed eternal, unstoppable, had ended as quickly as it had begun, but Hallownest was still in ruins. The infection ending didn't bring back the dead, didn't restore what had been destroyed, didn't rebuild what had fallen. The kingdom was still mostly empty, still largely abandoned. Buildings still stood crumbling and unused, but at least it was quiet now, peaceful. The air no longer buzzed with the Radiance's desperate rage. The dreams were just dreams again, not invasions. Minds were free to be themselves without fear of corruption. The curse that had hung over Hallownest for so long was finally truly lifted, but the victory came at a cost. In the Black Egg Temple, the night's shell began to crack. The void that had filled it, that had made it what it was, began to pour out like smoke. The night had done what it came to do. It had ended the Radiance, had used the void within itself and all its siblings to consume the goddess of light. But that effort had taken everything. The small black shell, the white mask, the tiny form that had travelled so far and overcome so much, it all began to dissolve. The night wasn't dying in any normal sense, because it had never been truly alive in any normal sense. It was returning to what it had always been. Void. There was no ceremony, no final words. The night had no voice to speak with anyway. It simply came apart, fragments of its shell falling away, darkness pouring out and dissipating. The being that had saved Hallownest, that had broken the seals and confronted the Radiance and united the void to destroy her, dissolved into nothingness. In the temple, the Hollow Knight's shell also broke fully. Whatever had been holding it together, duty, will, some final remnant of purpose, gave way once the Radiance was destroyed. It collapsed in its chains, the massive form crumpling, orange light fading from the cracks in its shell. It had been imprisoned for decades, had suffered in silence for longer than any being should have to suffer. And now, finally it was released. Both siblings were gone. The Hollow Knight who had tried and failed to contain the Radiance, and the Knight who had succeeded in destroying her. Both had been created for the sole purpose of dealing with the goddess's revenge. Both had been tools of the Pale King's desperate plan, and both had fulfilled their roles at the cost of their own existence. The Black Egg Temple stood silent, empty except for chains that held nothing anymore, and the settling dust of crumbled shells. Outside the temple in Dirtmouth, Hornet stood alone. The infection was gone. She could feel that much. The oppressive weight that had hung over the kingdom for so long had lifted. But at what cost? The knight who had accomplished this was gone. The Hollow Knight was freed from its torment, but that probably meant it was gone too. Her mother, Hera, had been killed when the night broke the seals. Hornet was more alone now than she had ever been. Born as the price of a sacrifice, raised in a dying kingdom, now standing in the ruins of everything that had existed before. She was the last remnant of Hallownest's royalty, the final guardian of a kingdom that was mostly empty. But there was something different in the air. The curse was lifted, the infection was gone, and that meant, for the first time in decades, there was possibility. Hallownest was still in ruins, yes, but ruins can be rebuilt. The kingdom was still mostly empty, but the survivors could return, could start over, could build something new from what remained. The cycle was broken. The Radiance was truly gone, not sealed away to potentially return again, but destroyed. The Pale King's kingdom had fallen, his grand vision proven insufficient, his terrible sacrifices revealed as ultimately necessary yet still tragic. The ruins of Hallownest stood quiet under the earth. The City of Tears, the crossroads, the fungal wastes, Deepnest, all still there. All damaged and empty, but no longer corrupted. The kingdom had fallen, but the land remained. And on that land, perhaps something new could eventually grow. The story of the Radiance was over. The goddess who had existed for ages, who had been worshipped and then forgotten, who had raged against that forgetting with such devastating consequences, was finally at rest. Not the rest she would have chosen. She would have preferred to be remembered, to be worshipped, to maintain her connection with her children. But at least it was rest. At least the desperate struggle was over. Hallownest slept. The Radiance slept deeper still, eternal sleep of true death. And in that sleep, finally, there was peace. Let's take a moment to look back at the full sweep of this story, from beginning to end, so we can see how all the pieces fit together. In the beginning, there was the Radiance, a higher being of pure light who existed primarily in the dream realm. She created or birthed the Moth tribe, and they worshipped her for countless generations, living in peaceful connection through shared consciousness. This was the Age of Light, a time of simple devotion and spiritual connection. Then the Pale King arrived, transforming from the ancient worm into a new form, bringing with him the gift of sapience. Bugs throughout Hallownest gained the ability to think, to reason, to plan. The Pale King built his kingdom, cities and stagways and grand architecture, all the trappings of civilization. And in their excitement over these new gifts and this new world, the moths gradually forgot the Radiance. She didn't disappear immediately. Higher beings don't die from lack of worship. But she weakened, became isolated in the dream realm, watched as her children forgot her completely. And as her loneliness grew, so did her anger and desperation. She began pushing her way back into the moth's awareness, forcing herself into their dreams, trying to be remembered again. This forced intrusion became the infection. The Radiance's light leaked into minds that couldn't contain it, stripped away. Sapience created violent, mindless husks. The plague spread throughout Hallownest despite every attempt to stop it. Traditional solutions failed because you can't fight a dream with swords, or cure a psychic invasion with medicine. The Pale King, desperate, created the vessels, thousands of children born in the void, designed to be perfectly hollow, perfect empty containers. Most failed and were discarded. One seemed perfect, the Hollow Knight. It was trained and prepared to serve as a prison for the Radiance. 3 loyal subjects agreed to become dreamers, to sleep forever as locks on that prison. The Radiance was sealed within the Hollow Knight, who was chained in the Black Egg Temple. The seals held. The infection stopped. Hallownest entered a golden age, believing itself saved. But the Hollow Knight had one tiny flaw. It had formed a bond with the Pale King, had developed one concept of duty. That was enough. Over decades, the Radiance worked at that crack, widened it, eventually broke through. The infection returned, the kingdom collapsed, the Pale King disappeared, Hallownest fell into ruin. Then the night returned, another vessel, one who had escaped the abyss long ago. It travelled through the ruins, grew in power, defeated the three dreamers, entered the Black Egg Temple. It confronted the failing Hollow Knight, used the Dream Nail to enter the dream space where the Radiance was imprisoned, and there, with the help of all its siblings' shades and the void itself, destroyed the Radiance completely. The infection ended instantly, but the Knight and the Hollow Knight were both gone, dissolved back into void. Hallownest remained in ruins, but the curse was lifted. The story was over. This is a story without true villains, only beings trying to survive, making choices that seemed necessary at the time, and creating tragedy through those very attempts at salvation. The Radiance wasn't evil. She was a goddess who had been worshipped for ages, who had loved her children in whatever way a being of pure light can love, who provided connection and warmth and meaning to the moths' lives. She didn't ask to be forgotten. She didn't choose loneliness. When she struck back with the infection, she wasn't being malicious. She was being desperate. She was fighting for her very existence. Because to be forgotten completely is a kind of death for a higher being. The Pale King wasn't cruel either. At least not intentionally. He was trying to give bugs a gift. The gift of thought, of civilization, of progress, and meaning beyond simple instinct. He built a magnificent kingdom, created wonders of architecture and culture. When his kingdom was threatened, he did everything he could think of to save it. Yes, his creation of the vessels was monstrous. And yes, his solutions caused immense suffering. But he bore the weight of those choices, understood their moral cost, and did them anyway because he believed they were necessary for the greater good. The Hollow Knight wasn't weak. It stood chained in darkness for decades, holding the Radiance within itself, suffering in silence. It fulfilled its purpose as well as any being could. The flaw that allowed the Radiance to break free wasn't a failure of will or strength. It was the inevitable result of being a living being who formed a connection with its father. Perfect hollowness was an impossible goal. The Hollow Knight couldn't be blamed for being something more than nothing, for having the smallest spark of consciousness. It tried. It endured longer than anyone should have to. In the end, it wasn't enough, but that doesn't mean it failed through any fault of its own. The knight wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. It didn't make noble speeches or claim to be saving the kingdom. It was just another vessel, drawn back by forces it didn't understand, doing what needed to be done. It succeeded where the Hollow Knight failed, not because it was better, but because circumstances were different. It had never known the Pale King's attention, had never formed that bond, had remained closer to true hollowness. And in succeeding, it ceased to exist, dissolved back into the void it came from. Everyone in this story was trying to survive, trying to protect what they loved, trying to find meaning in their existence. The moths wanted connection and peace. The Radiance wanted to be remembered. The Pale King wanted to build something lasting. The Hollow Knight wanted to fulfill its duty. The Knight wanted... what? We don't know. Perhaps just to answer a call, to complete a journey, to do what it was meant to do. And all of this, the centuries of worship, the building of kingdoms, the terrible experiments, the sealing and the breaking and the final battle, All of it came from one simple moment, the moths beginning to forget. If they had maintained their worship, if they had found a way to honour both the Radiance and accept the Pale King's gifts, if there had been room in the world for both spiritual connection and conscious thought, none of the tragedy would have happened. But that's not how it worked. Progress meant leaving the old ways behind. Civilization meant forgetting the spiritual. Thought meant losing the dream connection. And in that loss, in that forgetting, the seeds of Hallownest's destruction were planted. The Radiance's revenge was terrible, yes, but it was born from genuine pain. The Pale King's solutions were monstrous, yes, but they were born from genuine desperation. Everyone was doing the best they could with the choices available to them, and still it ended in tragedy. That's what makes this story so profoundly sad. It's not about good versus evil. It's about incompatible needs, about beings who couldn't coexist even though none of them were truly wrong. The Radiance deserved to be remembered. The bugs deserved the gift of thought. The kingdom deserved to survive. But somehow, having all those things at once proved impossible, and in trying to achieve them, everyone lost what they were fighting for. The waste of it all is staggering. Thousands of vessels created and discarded. 3 dreamers sleeping forever for a solution that only delayed the inevitable. An entire kingdom built and then fallen into ruins. All of it because a goddess was forgotten and couldn't accept that forgetting. But it's over now. Finally. Truly over. The Radiance isn't sealed away, waiting to break free again. She's destroyed, gone beyond any possibility of return. The cycle is broken. The story has reached its end. This story, at its deepest level, is about memory and forgetting. About what happens when we discard the past in our rush toward the future. When we forget what we once held sacred in our pursuit of progress. The moths forgot the Radiance, and that forgetting nearly destroyed everything they had built in her absence. It's about the cost of civilization. The Pale King's gift of sapience was genuinely wonderful. It allowed bugs to think, to create, to build marvels of culture and architecture. But that gift also made them vulnerable in new ways, created new weaknesses, new possibilities for suffering. Progress came with a price, and that price turned out to be far higher than anyone anticipated. It's about sacrifice and love. The Hollow Knight loved its father, in whatever minimal way a mostly hollow being could love, and that love doomed it. The 3 dreamers loved their kingdom enough to sleep forever. The White Lady and Pale King loved Hallownest enough to create and sacrifice thousands of their own children. Hornet was created because Hera loved her tribe enough to demand an heir before accepting eternal sleep. Love permeates this story, even though it's often unspoken, even though it often leads to tragedy rather than happiness. It's about emptiness and light, about void and consciousness, about the fundamental oppositions that exist in the world. Light represents awareness, thought, connection, but also invasion, corruption, forced control. Darkness represents emptiness, absence, peace, but also loneliness, loss, the end of all things. Neither is purely good or evil. The Radiance's light brought connection to the moths, but became infection when forced on the unwilling. The void brought hollowness to the vessels, but also brought the power to finally end the cycle. And perhaps most importantly, it's about endings being necessary. The Radiance couldn't fade gracefully into memory. Her rage and pain made her lash out, made her become something destructive. The Pale King's kingdom couldn't survive forever. It was built on compromises and sacrifices that eventually proved insufficient. The cycle of infection and sealing couldn't continue indefinitely. Eventually, something had to break permanently. The night breaking that cycle, destroying the Radiance completely rather than sealing her away again, was necessary. Painful, yes. Tragic, yes, but necessary. Some things cannot be fixed, or healed, or saved. Some conflicts have no solution except ending completely. The Radiance could never accept being forgotten. Hallownest could never return her to prominence without losing what made it Hallownest. The only resolution was for one side to cease existing entirely, and so the light went out. Finally, permanently, the Radiance's light was extinguished. It was the ending she would never have chosen, but it was an ending nonetheless. And in endings, there is a kind of peace. The struggle is over. The desperate fight for existence is concluded. The world can rest. Hallownest sleeps in its ruins, quiet at last, the orange glow gone from its stones. The Radiance sleeps deeper still, not the sleep of dreams, but the sleep of true death, gone beyond any possibility of waking. The vessels sleep in the abyss, their small broken forms finally at rest after serving their terrible purpose. The dreamers sleep their eternal sleep, their sacrifice complete, even if it proved only partially successful. Everything sleeps, and in that sleep finally there is peace, not the peace of the ancient days when the moths dreamed together under the Radiance's light. That peace is lost forever. Not the peace of Hallownest's golden age when the kingdom seemed eternal. That peace was always an illusion, but a different kind of peace. The peace of endings, of stories concluded, of struggles finished. The world doesn't need to fight anymore. The Radiance doesn't need to rage against forgetting. The kingdom doesn't need to sacrifice its children for survival. Everyone and everything can simply rest. And rest, after such long struggle, is perhaps the kindest gift of all. Thank you for listening to this long, sad, beautiful story. The tale of the Radiance is one of Hollow Knight's most tragic threads. A story without true villains, where everyone was trying their best and still everything fell apart. I hope walking through it helped you understand her character better, helped you see how the infection wasn't just a plague, but a goddess's desperate cry to be remembered. The Radiance's story is over now. She's gone, finally at peace after centuries of struggle. Hallownest sleeps in its ruins, and you can sleep too, letting this story carry you gently into your own dreams. If this helped you rest, consider leaving a like tomorrow, or subscribing for more lore explorations like this one. Sleep well, Wanderer. The light has finally gone out, and the darkness is peaceful. Let it cradle you softly as you drift away. The ancient kingdoms are at rest, the gods are silent, and the only sound is the quiet breathing of a world finally able to sleep without fear. Good night.